The story broke overnight that World Boxing, the new body in charge of boxing for elite sport at Olympic level, had decided that they're going to sex test all of their athletes. They specifically named Iman Khalif in announcing this news. Iman got all sorts of headlines during the Paris 2024 Olympic Games on her way to winning the gold medal. Now, I've spoken to Iman in Doha a couple of months ago. I'll replay some of that interview. But before then, I wanted to take you to an endocrinologist, somebody who actually knows what is involved in sex testing and why it's not as simple as XX female and XY male. There's a whole spectrum in between, and none of us in the media know where Iman sits. In fact, it's Iman's business. But here is Dr. Ada Chong, actually Professor Ada Chong from Melbourne University. Ada, it's good to talk to you again. And unfortunately, it's always when one of these very complex scenarios kind of hits the news and it becomes overly simplified to the point where the news is often wrong. So I just wanted to try and get from you, being an expert in this area, what does DSD mean? And is it just one thing? Does it mean people who maybe think they're female are males and should not be allowed to compete?
So DSD, there's many terms, and DSD traditionally was termed disorders of sexual differentiation, or differences in sexual differentiation, or intersex. Um, Many people prefer the term variations in sex characteristics, and it encompasses over 40 known conditions. So there's no one DSD. There's many, many types of conditions, and that's because sex development is really complicated. It's not just men and women. It's not just XX and XY makes woman and man, respectively. It's complicated.
Yeah. What do you say when people say to you, but the science says there's only male and female?
The science says there is not just male and female. I've got patients who are living proof of this. So sex development, it starts off with the chromosome. So there's XX, which is typically for the large majority of people female, or XY chromosomes, and XY is typically male. But everybody as a fetus starts off as a female. And then if you have a Y chromosome, it usually has a gene called SRY, which typically triggers the development of testes in an embryo. So then the testes then produce hormones. So typically testosterone if you have testes, and then that drives the development of males' reproductive structures like penis, scrotum. The SRY gene is on the Y chromosome, but so if you have XX, then ovaries develop, and then the ovaries then produce the hormone estrogen. And so hormones like testosterone and estrogen then act on receptors on cells. So like they're like the sensors on the cells, and they shape the development of the internal and the external genitalia. So what it looks like from the outside, and the internal organs like the uterus, as well as changes that happen during puberty. So sex development is sort of like this complicated process that goes from the chromosomes to the genes, and then to the organs, and then to hormones, and then finally to the hormone receptors. And so if you have a problem at any of those steps, and because there's so many steps, there are multiple problems that can develop at any of those points. You may not develop typically. So if you have XY chromosomes, you may not develop into have male genitalia because of a problem at one of those steps. And when you have a problem at one of those steps, it's called a DSD, or a difference in sexual development. And it could be like, we know of over 40 conditions. So there are sort of 40 different steps where that process um, could be aberrant.
We often think this only happens in less developed countries.
hmm
That
And often that's because we have better access to healthcare in Western countries and more developed countries, and often we have access to prenatal testing. Right? Often people will test for Down syndrome, for example, early on in the pregnancy. And so often we know what the chromosomes are, or whether there's some sort of genetic difference quite early on.
There is a possibility, isn't there, that a baby is born, the doctor says it's female, that child
Mhm.
is raised as a female and
Hmm.
only finds out much later on that they have XY chromosomes. And so what then, in a case of sport, we know it's happened in world athletics, and now we've got world boxing also doing gender testing or sex testing to
Hmm.
determine the breakdown here. But it is possible to have XY chromosomes and still be able to compete as a female.
Yeah, so,
How does that work?
one of the common, well, not common, but among people with DSDs, one of the common variations is androgen insensitivity syndrome. So you may have XY chromosomes, but I talked about the receptor. You have testosterone, but the receptors don't sense testosterone. So we call it androgen insensitivity. So that it's insensitive to testosterone. And so the person develops physical characteristics that are like a stereotypical female, and they develop breasts, they have external genitalia that is like a female. And um, we generally presume that whilst they may have high levels of testosterone when you measure it in the blood, that testosterone is not active. So they don't develop the changes, the typical changes that we see at puberty that happens for males.
Is it possible to tell just by looking at someone?
No, you cannot tell.
Okay,
But on
so
the outside,
yeah,
someone with androgen insensitive syndrome looks like a female.
okay, all right. So this is really good because it's really it concerns me when I see headlines about people that we don't know. This is a really sort of private matter, isn't it? And
Absolutely. It's
sometimes comes as a shock to the person involved, and yet
absolutely.
here's the world talking about them in often really terrible ways.
Yeah, I think we need to remember that at the end, there's a human. And so we need to be mindful not to dehumanize people with DSDs and people um, who may be undergoing these tests, and often like who we demand to um, undergo sex testing, like who decides whether somebody needs to have sex testing or not. And often it's based on these um, stereotypical Western notions of femininity. And often people of color or people from, who don't necessarily, um, it's often people of color who are subject to these questions more so than people from, Western Caucasian backgrounds, because we often base our a perception of, who's male, who looks female, who looks male, based on these Western notions of femininity.
And so one of the other reasons for this, I guess, is to make it fair for everybody. Does this sort of testing need to take place for everyone at a stage before people get to elite sport and before they're put on some sort of an international stage where, this kind of very, I don't even know what is the right word to describe it, but complex discussions, overly simplified, and can become terribly upsetting for a whole range of people involved.
No, I think this is really complex, and there's a whole lot of sex texting in sport. There's a whole lot of ethical concerns about privacy, human rights, fairness. Like these tests often, they target women who don't conform to these, narrow gender norms, and they reinforce these sort of sexist and often racist stereotypes. And you can cause a lot of harm by exposing people to this sort of invasive scrutiny and stigma and trauma. And I don't know whether we should be testing everybody. The yield would be really low. If you did sex testing, like World Athletics are proposing, on everybody who wants to compete in the female category, the yield would be really low, and there's a whole lot of ethical issues associated with that, and the potential to cause a lot of harm to cisgender um, women without DSDs. And I think you really need to consider the viewpoints of women who compete in this sport, whether that's something that they would they would want.
Yeah. And therein lies an issue as well, because some want it, some don't.
Mm.
And there's just it's incredibly difficult for elite sport at that end. But I really appreciate you explaining the complexities of this and how it's certainly not a black and white issue,
It's
and how
definitely not black
nobody
and
can
white.
tell just by looking at somebody.
No, and I think the issue is that humans are so diverse, and it's very hard to box every human into these two binary male female categories when humans don't exist like that.
And now I'm going to take you back to part of the interview that I did with Aman earlier in Doha. So I'm standing here with Iman Khalif, but she's much more interested in watching what's happening down below. Iman, it's really nice to meet you.
Thank you so much and welcome.
Yeah, well, I should be welcoming you because you're also a guest here.
Yes.
But you've been training in Qatar.
Yes.
What are you training for?
Hello and good morning. I'm here for training camp for 22 days. So this training camp for the prepared for the World Championship in September. That's it.
Well, let's talk about the reason you're here, and it's because you are now the Olympic champion.
Yes.
That must have been, well, I know it was a real roller coaster ride, but tell me about how the Olympics has changed your life, because when you got home, it must have been an incredible reaction in Algeria.
بطبيعة الحال أي أحد يتوج بطل أولمبي راح تتغير حياته، هذا شيء أكيد. بعد ما توجت بالميدالية الذهبية ومشيت بلدي بالجزائر، يعني كان استقبال جد حار. وكانوا عديد من الناس ينتظروني في الجزائر، يعني هذا الشيء كتير متشرف به وكتير فرحني بزاف. ويعني بعد الألعاب الأولمبية أكيد تغيرت حياتي، اليوم أنا بطلة أولمبية. إن شاء الله نزيد نقدم أكثر ونبقى في هذا المنوال.
What about the reaction from your mum and dad, your mother and father? What did they say to you?
بالنسبة للعائلة، نهضر لك على العائلة ككل. أكيد هي ردة فعل فخر واعتزاز وحب. ولكن بعد ما كنا في الأولمبياد كانت كاينة تاع الحملة حملة التنمر. فالحملة كانوا متأثرين كتير، ولكن بعد الفوز يعني أصبحوا فخورين ومفتخرين. كل العائلة اجتمعت في البيت لما كان النهائي، يعني وهم لحد هذه الساعة هم كتير فخورين.
How has that experience changed you? Not just being a champion, but of course everything you went through. And then when you got home and the love of your family, I guess it changed everything. But is your life different now?
يعني هي تغيرت حياتي، ما نقولكش ما تغيرش حياتي تغيرت، يعني نسبة 70% حتى 80%. الميدالية الذهبية أكيد بعد الواحد لما يصبح بطل أولمبي وحقق حلم الأولمبي تغيرت حياتي من ناحية الأهداف، من ناحية مستقبلي القادم، كذلك من ناحية عائلتي، كذلك من ناحية الناس اللي بيشجعوني ويساندوني. والخبرة اللي اكتسبتها في أولمبياد باريس مدت لي يعني الكثير وخلاتني نزيد نتحمس ونزيد نتفائل باش نقدم أكثر.
Okay, so let's talk about your goals now.
Yes.
How far can you go? What do you want next?
Of course, I want to continue for my dream, for my success maybe the next gold medal.
Los Angeles?
Los Angeles, yes.
There might be some trouble with Trump.
No, the politic is politic and sports staying in sports. So I need to, and always I focus with sport and with my job. That's it.
Would you ring Trump? Would you give him a call and say, I need to talk to you? You need to let me in because I need to defend my gold medal?
Now, this is, the world is difficult now. Everything change, everything difficult. So for me, I stay focused just for my job, just for boxing, for my dream, for my family. So and I make distance for the politics with sport and
Is it easy to make that distance? Because, the way it impacts you, obviously. So how do you just keep it separate? How hard is that?
هي مش حاجة سهلة، أكيد شيء مش سهل، ولكن زعما واش نقدر ندير باش نبعد يعني بين الرياضة وبين السياسة، لأن الرياضة تبقى رياضة والسياسة تبقى سياسة، ما تقدرش تدخل الرياضة في السياسة. هذا الشيء، هذه الظاهرة اللي رانا نشوفوا فيها كثير، خاطر بزاف تدخل السياسة في الرياضة وين تأثر على الرياضيين، تأثر على نتائجهم، وهذا الشيء اللي يدور بالعكس على performance تاع الرياضي.
Life is funny.
Yes. Exactly.
You never know what's going to happen next. And sometimes you get the great thrills like winning a gold medal, but you cannot know what is going to come from that and the reaction. And so each day, is it something you remind yourself of? Do you say, this is me, this is why I'm doing this, I'm doing it for the generations after me, I'm doing this because I believe the world should be away from politics? What goes through your mind?
بالنسبة لي أنا كاين عديد من الشباب، يعني هذا الشيء اللي يخليني كذلك، هو اللي محفزني أكثر بالدرجة الأولى، هو حب الشباب وشغفهم يعني في النجاح مثلي. اليوم كاين بزاف شباب وشابات وأطفال يعني يتبعوني ويشوفوني يشجعوني كبطلة أولمبية. إيمان أنا حابين نكونوا بطلة أولمبية كما أنتي، أنا حابين نكونوا في الملاكمة. يعني هذا الشيء هو اللي راهم خليني نزيد نواصل، باش علاش؟ باش نبين يعني للجيل الجديد، نزيد نظهر انه يعني الرياضة هي قبل كل شيء، الرياضة هي روح رياضية، هي المبادئ، هي القيم الرياضية. ويعني هذا الشيء اللي راهم خليني نواصل، هو حب الجيل الجديد.